What's up, everyone? There comes a time and place where every website needs to fetch some kind of data to then be processed and rendered on the front end. With Next.js, you're able to fetch that data on both the server and client side. You can even stream components that depend on that data. In this video, I'll cover the best ways to fetch and use data. If you want the code that I use in this video, there's a link to the repo in the description. Now, let's dive in. If you're planning on having a primarily server-side rendered website, you'll want to use server components to fetch your data. You can use server components to fetch data from an external API, a headless CMS, or directly from your database. Since sensitive information is not sent from the server to the client, you are able to safely use your credentials using environment variables when querying on the server side. You don't have to worry that they will be exposed because of that separation between server and client. This project I'm working on currently is set up with Payload CMS. That means I can use a REST API to communicate with the data stored from my headless CMS. So let's see what that looks like by going to my slug page.tsx file, and we're just going to export a default async function called page. And here we're going to get our data in a constant, and we're going to await fetch, which will be from our local host 3000 API pages. Then we can get our pages in a constant, and then we'll await that data.json, and then we can just log our pages. And because each page needs to have something returned, we'll just return a div that says page. Now we can spin up our development server, and now we can see what this looks like by going to my contact page. So now I'm at this page, and I can see I have 3 documents: our contact, our about, and our home page. By default, our fetch response is not cached. This route will be pre-rendered by Next.js, and the output will be cached to boost performance. We could add to the end of our fetch here the cache option no store, and this will use dynamic rendering instead. You're also able to use an object relational mapper, or ORM, to communicate with your database and get data out of your database. Tools like Prisma make this possible. However, you are also able to communicate directly with your database, and I can do that using the database option from Payload CMS. So what I'll do is I'm going to import get payload from payload, and then I'm going to import the config from payload config. Then we can initialize our constant payload by awaiting get payload and pass in the config. And I can comment out our data and our pages and create a new constant called pages to await our payload db find, and we'll search for our collection of pages. Then we can just log those pages. And we'll see, once we refresh, that nothing has changed. We see the same data coming through. So at the end of the day, with all of these working roughly the same way, it's up to you and how you want to query your data. Now, there is a time and place for data fetching with server components, but there might be circumstances where you want to use a client component to fetch data instead. For example, if you want to stream data to speed up your site's performance, you can use React's use hook to do this. To show this off, I'm going to go to my project and go to my components directory, which does not exist. So in the source, I'll open a new file, and I'm going to create a components directory and create a pages directory inside of that, which will have an index.tsx file. And in this file, it's going to be a client component, so I'll use client. I'll import use, which I just mentioned, from React, as well as our page type from our payload types. Then we can export a default function called pages, which will take our pages, and our pages will be of type page, which will be wrapped in a promise, and we'll expect an array of pages to come back. We can then set a constant called all pages, where we'll use the use hook and get our pages. Then we can return an unordered list of all our pages mapped to list items with the page updated at returned. Then I'll import this into my page.tsx file so I can import pages from our components pages. And this is a default export, so I don't need curly braces around this. I'm also going to import Suspense from React. So now I'm going to delete all of this old code, and then I'm going to set a new constant called data, which will fetch our local host. It'll get our API pages, and we will just pass in a cache no store option here. Then we're going to get our JSON response. Then we're going to get our docs from our response. Now we can, inside this div, pass in a suspense, which will have a fallback of div page loading, and close that div. And inside the suspense, we will have our pages component, and we'll pass in our data. So now when I save and refresh, we can see all of our updated at timestamps right there. Now, if I wanted to add more data, I could by just adding our page.title, and then we can see the title as well as the timestamp in there. A quick note about streaming. Streaming is used to break up a page's HTML into smaller chunks to speed up initial load time. This gives the perception that your site is moving along faster than it actually is. What this does is it uses React Suspense boundary to continue loading a page even while you're still waiting on data to be returned from an external source or your database. The suspense boundary takes a fallback, which is what's displayed until the promise is resolved and the page is displayed. It should also be noted that streaming is only available if you have cache components enabled in your Next.js config. And that option is only available to you in the Canary branch of Next.js 15. Of course, with a payload this small, it's unlikely we would see the effects of a suspense boundary, even if we had the experimental features enabled and we were on a slow network. You don't have to use the fetch API if you don't want to. You're more than welcome to use other data fetching libraries like SWR or TanStack Query. You'll need to follow the documentation provided by those tools in order to get started there. Before we talk about handling duplicate requests, check to make sure you're subscribed to my channel and receiving notifications so you never miss when I release more content about Next.js, Payload CMS, Tailwind CSS, and more. If you're tired of trying to keep up with all of the news and things that are happening in the web development industry, consider subscribing to my newsletter, Next in Dev. You'll receive a bi-weekly overview of everything that I can find on the internet that has happened in our industry. There's a link to that in the description. Thank you for your support. Now let's get back to it. By default, Next.js extends your fetch requests to memoize them automatically. That means that unless you opt out, your fetch calls are automatically deduplicated to conserve resources. And that memoization lasts the lifetime of the request. If you're not using fetch and are accessing your database directly, you can wrap your database call in a React.cache function to deduplicate your requests. Let's see that in action. So I am going to go back over to my page.tsx, go to the suspense, and pull out cache from React as well. Now again, I can remove all of this for now and reinitialize our constant payload by awaiting get payload and pass in our config. Then we will set a constant called getCached pages, and in our cache function, we will pass in an async anonymous function. And in our anonymous function, we will have a constant called db for database page, and we'll await our payload db find collection pages, and then return our db page. So now we can set up a console log to get cached pages, which we need to call that function. And since it's an async function, we do need to await that function call. Then we can return a div that just says pages. Now when I save this, we'll see our data refresh, and then we can refresh the page. And we see here all of our documents come through. Fetching and handling data in Next.js is very simple to do. With the tools we've covered so far, you're able to build powerful and dynamic websites using data that you store in your database, your CMS, or from an external API. There's much more to fetch than we've covered so far, so let's discuss that now. Since Next.js simply extends fetch, you're able to use everything in the fetch API. One option we've already looked at is the cache option. The cache option, which I'll show again over here, if we have a constant called data, and we can fetch, and then we can just include an empty string because we want to look at the options. So here we can see that our options of cache comes with no cache, default, no store, force cache, only if cache, and reload. The cache option allows you to control your caching behavior on each request. We've already covered the default case, but you can set this to no store. And what this does is it forces Next.js to fetch from the server on each request. You can also set it to force cache, and this will check for a fresh cache match on every request. If there isn't a match for the cache or it's a stale cache, Next.js will hit the API again and store the fresh version with a new resource. There are some Next-specific options as well. The first one that we can go over is revalidate, and this sets the cache lifetime of a resource. We can set this to false, which will cache the resource forever, or 0, which will prevent it from being cached ever. And as I did just before, a number can be provided, which is in seconds to set a limit to how long a resource should be cached. Here is 5 minutes. Now you're not able to use a revalidate number here and, for example, cache no store, because these are in direct conflict with one another. Neither option will be used in production. Both will be ignored and the default behavior will be used. If you do this by accident, you'll start seeing warnings in your console during development. So I'll set this back to the default behavior. And then you also have the option to include an array of strings for your tags. This allows you to set tags on your fetch call to then later be used for on-demand revalidation to purge the cache using revalidate tag from Next.js. Other options you might use are things like body, which allows you to send data to the server. You'll use this together with another common option, method. So when this is set to post or put, you'll often send a request body to the API to update or create a piece of content or data. Credentials is another option you might use, which will give you the ability to either omit, include, or only accept from the same origin the credentials for this request. So we'll just set this to include, and then finally cover one last option, which is our headers. And you can use this to set things like your content type, which might be something like application JSON. Or also if you have an authorization header, you can do that using bearer and then your bearer token. And that's all there is to it to fetching data. You have a lot of flexibility in how you fetch and cache data using Next.js. Be sure to explore all your options and other caching strategies as they come up for your projects. If you found this video helpful, please like it and share it with others who might also find it useful. Check to make sure you're subscribed to my channel and receiving notifications so you never miss when I release more content about Next.js, Payload CMS, Tailwind CSS, and more. If you're tired of trying to keep up with all of the industry news, consider subscribing to my newsletter, Next in Dev, to stay up to date with all of the industry news in web development. Again, there's a link to that in the description. If you have suggestions or questions, please leave those in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Until then, I'll see you on the next one.